Sinwar, the leader of Hamas who was killed in an Israeli military operation in Gaza yesterday, was a brutal, vicious terrorist responsible for the death of American citizens, Israelis, and civilians from more than 30 countries across the world. His decision, and it was very much his decision, to launch the terrorist attacks of October 7th, unleashed a year of tragedy in the Middle East. 1,200 people murdered on October 7th, 254 hostages kidnapped and hauled into Gaza, including children, infants, elderly, and men and women of all ages. More than 40,000 people dead in Gaza, many of them civilians. That is the blood-soaked legacy that Yahya Sinwar leaves behind. He didn't just launch this conflict, but for the past year has refused the efforts of the United States and our partners to end it, refused to return home the hostages who have been separated from their families for more than a year, refused to agree to a ceasefire proposal endorsed by the United Nations Security Council and countries around the world, and who in recent weeks refused to even negotiate at all on a ceasefire and an end to the war. There are 101 hostages who remain in Gaza, including 7 Americans. And of course, there are 2 million Palestinians who continue to suffer the consequences of Sinwar's decision to endanger their lives. The path that Sinwar wanted for the region, death, destruction, instability, chaos, is a path that we know the people of the region reject. The horrors of the past year cannot be the future, and they do not need to be the future. It is time to chart a different path. So over the days ahead, the United States will redouble our efforts to return the hostages home, to bring an end to this war, to alleviate the suffering of the Palestinian people, and to allow the people of Gaza to begin to rebuild their lives. With that, Matt.
Okay. I'll start with this, obviously, but please don't close the briefing without allowing me or someone else to ask about the other very big story of the day, which is, of course, the new UN partition proposal for Western Sahara.
Okay.
So when you say that over the course of the day, over the days ahead, the U.S. will redouble your efforts, how exactly is that going to happen?
So a few things about that. First of all, as you know, we've been trying to achieve a ceasefire that returns the hostages home, alleviates the suffering of the Palestinian people, and ends the war for many months now. And the chief obstacle to reaching that ceasefire and bringing it into the war has been Sinwar, who has refused to negotiate at all in recent weeks and has said no time and time again. That obstacle has obviously been removed. Can't predict that that means that whoever replaces Hamas will agree to a ceasefire, but it does remove what has been in recent months the chief obstacle to getting one. So we're going to continue to work with our partners to try to find an end to the war. The secretary already today, while on Air Force One with the president flying to Berlin, called the Prime Minister of Qatar, who has been one of our 2 mediators, other mediators, working to reach an end to the war. He called the Foreign Minister of Saudi Arabia to talk about the path forward, and he will be having additional contacts in the days ahead.
Right, but what exactly does redouble your efforts mean?
So it means redoubling our efforts to try and get an agreement that would bring the hostages home. Look,
I'm
not
asking you for the logistics. I understand what you want.
So,
I want to know what that actually means, redouble. Does it mean that you're going to be making twice as many calls?
So you know the proposal that has been on the table for some time. We're going to be
Right.
trying to push that proposal forward. We now have a different, well, we don't know who will be on the other end of the negotiating table now, but it certainly won't be Sinwar. So there's a different, it is a very different situation. Now, I don't want to predict too much what our efforts will look like over the course of the days, because we are just hours after what is a seismic event that changes the nature of this conflict. But we believe it is an opportunity to try and bring an end to this war, and we're determined to try and seize that opportunity.
Okay. But
Sinwar died yesterday.
He was, so I assume that he died yesterday. So I will leave the Israelis to speak to the exact results, but it was as the result of an operation that they conducted yesterday. I don't believe that he lay where he was brought down for hours and died later, but the Israelis can speak to that. They will be the ones that conduct any testing and can provide any results.
No confirmation, but that's your belief
The
or
operation
understanding?
they carried out was yesterday. I assume that he died instantly or fairly shortly thereafter, but the Israelis can speak to that.
Does the leadership in Qatar, after the secretary spoke to them, do you suspect or do you know if they know who Hamas's chosen successor is going to be?
I don't think anyone can say with any certainty. Hamas has a process that they go through in these situations. We saw them go through that process after the death of Hanea. I could only expect that they will go through that process again. I don't think anyone can predict. People can always speculate, of course, about who the next leader of Hamas will be, but I don't think anyone can predict with any degree of certainty. But what we would hope, is that whoever the next leader of Hamas is, he will look at what has happened over the past year and look at the suffering that Hamas's actions have brought upon the Palestinian people who they aim to represent, whose cause they aim to advance, and will look and decide that they ought to pursue a different path forward. They ought to pursue a path that isn't one of death and destruction and chaos and harm to Israeli civilians and harm to Palestinian civilians, but one that the United States has presented, that Egypt has presented, that Qatar has presented, that other countries in the region and around the world have presented and endorsed. And so that's what we'll be pushing for.
Are you communicating that to, indirectly, to, I guess, the remaining leadership there? That, are you communicating that is the United States' hope and what you're pushing for?
So I'm not going to speak about any communications that our mediators will have. We always let them speak to those. We are communicating with Qatar. We'll be communicating with other partners in the region. I think that our position is fairly well known. Now, of course, we don't know who the person at the other end of the phone is going to be. We don't know who will be making decisions for Hamas now. What we do know is that the person who had been the chief obstacle to moving forward with an end of the war is now fortuitously no longer with us.
Last question. So I know that you hope this is a big opportunity for ceasefire negotiations and a deal and return of the hostages, but a little more macro, what about for a two-state solution? How do you think?
Continued fighting a viable path for the return of hostages at all, or is it a ceasefire?
So as I just said, long term, no, we don't believe it is. We don't believe that it's not just that whether it's a path for the return of hostages, that you could see how you might return some hostages in one-off operations here and there, but no, you're not going to return all the hostages through fighting, nor are you going to achieve a durable, lasting end to the war just by fighting on the battlefield, because you kill one terrorist and see that terrorist replaced by someone else. And so ultimately, you need to find not just, you need to achieve not just military objectives, but also political objectives, and you need to create a pathway forward for the Palestinian people.
Are there specific steps that you want to see Israel take in the coming days and weeks toward a ceasefire?
Now, we're going to have those conversations privately with them before we talk about it publicly. Again, as I predicted, I would say this in response to another question. We are just hours after this event. I think it's appropriate to let the president have a conversation with the prime minister, appropriate for the secretary to have conversations with his counterparts before we prescribe too much of that from this podium.
And sorry, last one. On the conversations that you mentioned Blinken has had today, has he specifically discussed post-war Gaza?
He has. Yeah.
Thank you, Matt. Just going back to your opening remarks and the statement that we heard from the VP.
Hamas and Israel, but we've been watching as Israel has been conducting these counterterrorism operations in Gaza because they say Hamas is reconstituting. If the time is now to bring an end to this conflict, should they stop those counterterrorism operations?
So Israel achieved an incredibly important strategic objective today, but their other strategic objectives remain. First and foremost among them, the return of the hostages, including the 7 Americans who remain held hostage. So we want to see those hostages returned home. I know Israel wants to see those hostages returned home, and it's important that they continue to work to return those hostages home. But ultimately, we want to make sure that they take the strategic objectives that they have accomplished, and today was a significant one, but they've accomplished other strategic objectives over the course of the past year in degrading Hamas's military capabilities to the extent that in no sense could they launch an attack today that looked anything like the attack of last October 7th. They are in no way a functioning military force the way that they were on October 7th, though they, of course, still maintain significant ability to wreak havoc and launch terrorist attacks. So what we want to see from them, and this is what we'll be discussing with them, is how they take those strategic objectives that they have met and turn that into an enduring strategic victory. And from our perspective, that means a path forward in Gaza that isn't just a military path forward for degrading Hamas and continuing to fight Hamas fighters over and over and seeing 100 fighters killed and 100 new fighters join over the course of a day or a month and being in this perpetual cycle of continuing to fight on the ground there. What we want to see is a path forward that brings the hostages home and sets the conditions for the day after, where you have reconstruction in Gaza, you have actual security in Gaza, and you have a political path forward for the people in Gaza that is determined by the people in Gaza. And so those are the conversations we are going to have with the government of Israel, as well as with our other partners in the days ahead. Those are the conversations the secretary started already today with his counterparts in Qatar and Saudi Arabia.
But I guess you didn't answer the question as to how the counterterrorism operations that are ongoing fit into that. If you want them to drive forth an enduring victory, you said, should they stop those counterterrorism operations because Hamas has already been dismantled to such a significant degree?
Look, Hamas still does pose a threat, and Israel still has a right to take on that threat, and they still have a right to try and put pressure on Hamas and try and free the hostages that remain there. But ultimately, we think the path forward is not just to continue military operations that they will have to repeat over and over again. Because in our judgment, and in the judgment of our partners in the region and our partners around the world, a path forward that doesn't include the reconstruction and security and rebuilding and a political path forward in Gaza is not a path that will actually provide an end to the war. And that's what we want to see ultimately, is an end to the war. Now, I can't tell you that that's something that we'll have agreement on with the Israeli government tomorrow or next week or with partners in the region, but it's something that we're going to continue to pursue.
And then do you have